He was seeing what everybody else saw, and he was thinking what nobody else thought. He questioned conventional wisdom. He brought fresh eyes, an open mind, came to an original interpretation. He was a trailblazer. As John Lewis said in his book, From Dry Bone to the Living Man, he's an English osteopath. He wrote, millions of people before Newton and Galileo had seen apples fall and pendulums swing, but practically none of them had taught the world what those simple and familiar phenomenon meant. So it was with Dr. Still. He did not invent a system of healing like the force of gravity. Osteopathy was always present. Something familiar to everyone, waiting for a perceptive mind to unlock its secrets. Millions of people had seen the same things he had seen, but practically none before Dr. Still had ever learned to work with nature and never against her in the healing art. So Still had some famous contemporaries, William Osler and the Mayo brothers. Osler said, as doctors, we should cure a few, help most, but comfort all. Mayo, one of the Mayo brothers, said the ideal of being a physician is to eliminate the need for the physician. So there was a lot of common thought about the fact that we ought to become more patient-centered, but with different approaches. At the same time, there was another notable contemporary, architect Louis Sullivan here in Chicago, who mentored Frank Lloyd Wright, said, form follows function. So there was a lot of similar thought going on at the same time. So I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, why didn't osteopathic thought recede? How have we been able to succeed? And how will we continue to lead? So that first question, why didn't osteopathic thought recede? Well, you all are familiar with the medicine approach in the late 1800s. It was puke, purge, bleed, and blister. So a lot of people were unsatisfied with that kind of an approach, and they were trying a lot of different approaches. Homeopathy, Thomsonianism, eclecticism, the waters, the artesian baths, the herbs, cereals. Thank you, Battle Creek, Michigan. But Still said, I'm going to look at the whole person, and I'm going to wrap that person in the mantle of caring. Now, I have a lot of MD friends and colleagues who say, well, I focus on the whole person, and I care about my patients, but I would submit that they may not have a full understanding of what that really means in the osteopathic profession. My most precious mentor was Dr. Mary Lou Butterworth, the only woman in her Kansas City class of 1954. She became an anesthesiologist, and she was famous in that city for singing lullabies to the little babies and children as she put them to sleep for surgery. And she said to me, the body is not a bunch of organs, each in its own little Ziploc bag hanging from a coat hanger. It is an integrated whole. Now, I want to give you a story that kind of exemplifies how that plays out. I got an email several years ago from one of my graduates from Chicago. She's emergency medicine residency trained, ultrasound fellowship trained, and she practices in a large hospital on the East Coast. And I have her permission to tell this story. She said a woman came into the ER in her mid-30s, and she was complaining of severe back pain off and on for about 6 months. So she did an examination on the patient, and really all she found was point tenderness at the mid-thoracic spine. And she could reproduce her pain with pressure on that point. So she got online and checked out viscerosomatic reflexes, refreshing her training at CCOM, and then she knew how to proceed. I would submit that she was not looking at osteopathic facts. She was looking at medical facts through the osteopathic lens. I'll tell you the rest of that story in a few more minutes. But Still's emphasis on caring was not anything new. Ambrose, 16th century surgeon, said, "It is the task of medicine. Cure sometimes, relieve often, care always." Now, Francis Peabody, MD, was addressing the medical students at Harvard in 1927, and he said, "The secret of caring for the patient is to care for the patient." Now, my favorite expression of this thought is from our old OB-GYN chair from Kansas City, Dr. Lee Davidson, long gone, and he said, "Your patients don't care what you know until they know that you care." And I have preached that to every single class of medical students, residents that I've ever spoken to since. Now, I found an interesting perspective on this point. I found an academic medicine article, December of 2005, written by Cooper, MD at Penn, Tauber, an MD at Boston University, and they wrote, "From the start, the culture of caring competed with the quest to objectify medicine in scientific terms. As scientific discovery leaped forward, caring was progressively eclipsed." It's been said that an MD who truly espouses the caring philosophy speaks more about them as a person than about their training. But this whole approach is embedded in our osteopathic training. It is part and parcel of our tenet number 1. One of the most osteopathic physicians that I know is one of my classmates, Bill Mayo. He's an ophthalmologist, for heaven's sakes. But he's an osteopathic ophthalmologist, and that makes all the difference. So there are different ways to manifest caring. So a friend of mine is an avid hiker. She flies all over the world to hike the most famous trails. Now, she's in her mid-70s, so you can imagine her knees have taken a toll. So she went to an orthopod here in town recently, and he said, "Act your age. You need a knee replacement." Needless to say, she went to a second orthopedic surgeon in town, and he said, "You know, what you're trying to do would be difficult for someone half your age. You need a knee replacement." So she went to a third orthopod here in town, and he said, "You are my hero. You need a knee replacement." Same advice, 3 wonderful surgeons. Guess which one is going to do her knee replacement later this fall? Yes, Walter, number 3, yes. Because he exemplified the caring approach. They all gave her exactly the same advice. Now, the Mayo Clinic recently did a survey of their patients, and they asked them, what are the 7 key traits that you feel identify who is the best qualified physician? And right at the top of the list was, takes a personal interest in me as a person. And if you haven't seen the famous Cleveland Clinic video on this same topic, I recommend it to you. Besides, an ounce of humility is worth more than a ton of arrogance. So Still really got this right. He got the whole person right, he got the caring right, and he got the women in medicine part right. So in 1892, Johns Hopkins admitted their first women into their very first class at their medical school. 1893 still had women, as you well know, in his first class of medical students. There was a very different perspective here. In 1892, Johns Hopkins was also trying to raise the princely sum of $7 million to build a new hospital, and they were running a little short on funds. So some of the ladies in Baltimore agreed to make up the difference. It was about $500,000 in the 1890s, but they had one caveat. You have to take women into your medical school class. So let's just say they felt the heat and they saw the light. But A.T. Still said, I opened the doors of my first school to women. Now, when I graduated from Kansas City, being a woman in medicine was pretty much the exception. Only 15% of all the physicians in the United States were women. And in our class, only 12%. So when I went into the practice of internal medicine at Mesa General Hospital in Arizona, I joined a staff with 180 physicians, give or take a few, on staff. 2 women, a pathologist and an OB-GYN, and then me. So I would imagine, looking back on that most of my patients had never had a woman as a physician. So I got this question fairly often. So what's it like being a woman doctor? Which I understood meant in comparison to the conventional view of what a doctor looks like. So my answer was, I don't know. I've never been a man doctor. But my less snarky response was, I'm not going to take care of my patients as a woman. I'm a woman who is a doctor who takes care of patients. So it was a very nice experience. So first of all, I had a lot of women who were my patients. And then they brought their husbands. And so I would take the history, I would then say, here's a gown, I'm going to step out and come back and give you your exam, and I would get this question. You mean you're going to examine everything? Yes. And besides, I'm the one that you want to do your rectal exam. You are? I got the smallest hands in town. So, my first question, osteopathic thought did not recede because Still was doing right thing, right time. So how have we been able to succeed? And I would say that's really the same answer. Right thing, right time. Now, think back to the fact that we are really a tiny minority and have been for a really long time. Even 100 years after Still enrolled his first class, physicians practicing in the United States that held the DO degree were barely 5% of all the physicians. So that meant that we were not allowed to be in different programs, we were not invited to entities, we were not, credentialing wasn't open to us, certification was not open to us. So this phrase, I think, summarizes it. We had to be everything to everyone inside the profession, because we were nothing to nobody outside the profession. And that thought, that perception still colors a lot of what we do because we are a minority. So let me tell you a story that helped me really understand this. As Dean of Chicago, I would take about 20 students to the state capitol every year for a day, and that was for 2 reasons. First of all, we wanted to teach students how to do advocacy for their patients and for their profession. And second of all, we wanted to take advantage of that opportunity to get better acquainted with the legislators and be sure they had a better understanding of what osteopathic medicine was all about. So we would rent a meeting room in one of the hotels near the Capitol and host an evening reception. And the order of the day was the legislators would go from meeting room to meeting room and meet their constituents. So I prepped the students. I said, okay, I want 2 of you by the door with me at all times. So I was wearing this pin, and they're going to flip a picture of it up or show it close if I stand correctly. So I don't know if you can, yeah, okay, you can see it. If it's a capital D and a period and a capital O and a period. And the reason I would wear it is because you're talking to the legislators. They're going around meeting a lot of people, and I wanted to keep that DO in front of them so that when we were talking to them, they'd remember who they were talking to. Okay? Got the scene? So first 2 students are standing by me. The first legislator comes in. I introduce myself and the 2 students, and then say something like, so have you had a chance to get very much acquainted with osteopathic medicine? You know, you didn't want to be rude. And well, the answer would be something like, well, no, not exactly. So, well, here, a couple of our students will be happy to tell you more about our profession and why they chose this degree. Off they would go. Next 2 students come up, stand by me. Next legislator comes in. Second verse, same as the first. They went off. Next 2 students came in. The third legislator, this was an interesting experience. Third legislator came in, looks at my pin, and she says, oh, before we had a chance to say anything, she said, I love you guys. My family loves you guys. Dairy Queen. So we have a little bit more to do in public awareness. Okay. But Raymond B. Fosdick, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation in the 30s, said, it is always the minorities that hold the key to progress. It is always through those who are unafraid to be different that advance comes to human society. Besides, only dead fish go with the stream. So part of our issue with public awareness has been addressed by the increasing growth of the profession. But that raises a lot of challenges. We have to be sure that when we grow the profession and bring it to new areas, that we are providing excellent medical education and wonderful role modeling as osteopathic physicians, and are putting our money where our mouth is to provide more graduate medical education. So it's definitely a challenge. Every physician, every DO that's ever been the first one in their town or the first one to apply for privileges at a new hospital, you are the only DO they've ever seen. You are representing the entire osteopathic profession. So we have to be sure that we have the highest preparation and training, that we are performing at the highest level, and that we are exemplifying the highest standards of integrity. Because we're being heavily scrutinized, especially in those situations. I've been there at a new hospital that we went to get privileges in, and it's a heavy responsibility. But I mean, why would we want to not be that well prepared anyway? But every DO who's ever been in that much of a minority situation understands the unintended consequences of being a minority. Now, growth has two big challenges, all the unintended consequences and change. So let me tell you a little bit about unintended consequences from a different perspective. We always think about those as being bad, but let me propose that maybe they're not always as good as we would like, but they're not always as bad as we fear. So I'm going to tell you about 5 unintended consequences that have occurred with this profession and how they've turned out very much better than we might have thought. Number 1, if you go back in your books about Still, he applied early in his career to give a public presentation at Baker University in Baldwin City, Kansas, on his philosophy. And they refused him. And they called him a lunatic. However, that meant that he was then able to start his own school and be completely in control of his own education and training of his philosophy. Number 2, J. Martin Littlejohn came to Kirksville. He was a patient, a student, a faculty, and then dean. It's kind of a meteoric career rise there. But as osteopathic thought developed, he and Still developed different perspectives that became irreconcilable, and Littlejohn left. The dean left, and his 2 brothers. However, they went to Chicago, started this school, and in 1917, Littlejohn went to England and started the British School of Osteopathy, which was the start of the osteopathic educational movement around the world. Number 3, you've probably all heard that in World War II, DOs were not allowed to enlist in the military as physicians. However, they stayed home and they built their practices and they spread the word about osteopathic medicine. Number 4, in 1962, you all know that the California Osteopathic Association merged with the California Medical Association, and the AOA House of Delegates revoked the charter for the COA. Now that started a dark decade in California for osteopathic medicine, but also for the AOA, because the California Osteopathic Association was the biggest state society in the entire association. Now that occurred in '62. In '63, the U.S. Civil Service Commission, citing the events that had happened in California, said, for our purposes, the DO and the MD degree are equivalent. It was the first time a U.S. governmental agency had made that determination. Okay, fifth thing. You might have heard about this thing, this ACGME thing, okay? So you all know what brought us to that position. Primarily a mismatch in numbers between DO graduates and the number of previously osteopathically accredited first-year residency positions, and then the problem of providing availability for our grads to be continued to be considered for fellowships. You know all that. You know all that. But let me tell you about a couple of conversations you might not have heard of. My very first meeting at the ACGME board, I was still the dean of CCOM, and one of the other board members, who was program director, came up to me and she said, I've never taken a DO in my residency program. What are the best DO schools? Let's see. I'm the dean of Chicago. We had a nice conversation. I included a lot more schools. At the same meeting, another board member, residency program director, came up to me and to tell me that he had taken a DO in his residency a couple of years before, happened to be one of my CCOM grads that I knew. And he was telling me what a great job he did and how he was such a good resident. That always warms a dean's heart. So a year later, that same program director came up to tell me about what was happening with that same resident who was completing his residency. That resident wanted to go into a particular specialty in a particular hospital, and he was not getting an invitation for an interview. So it turned out that the fellowship director was also a graduate of that same residency. So the residency director called the fellowship director and said, how come you're not offering an interview to this resident? He's great. Fellowship director said, well, I don't really know about this DO thing. And the residency director said, well, you better learn. So, and he got the residency and the fellowship. Now, you may have also heard that the brand new common program requirements for ACGME just went into place 27 days ago. And there's a whole new section in there that says every single program has to specify their mission and aims. And it says right in the document that a program that is focusing on training physician scientists is going to have a different focus in their curriculum than a program that is focused on training physicians for community-based practice. It's in the standards now. It's great, great news. And Dr. Uhas, Dr. Adams, Dr. Forstein, and I, as some of your DO board members, were all very active in the new emphasis on medically underserved areas and populations, residency training in medically underserved areas and populations. And I also saw John Seeley over here, who came in from Detroit, to speak about the challenges of doing residency training in medically underserved areas. So let's just say maybe those were unintended consequences. So those are my 5. Now, change. When you have growth, you're going to have change. Eric Shinseki, who used to be Secretary of the VA, said, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. Let me just say, if you want to leave your footprints in the sands of time, you better not drag your feet. So, third point, third question, how are we going to continue to lead? And my answer is going to be very much the same. Doing the right thing, right time. My favorite poem ends like this. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. A.T. Still made a difference. We made a difference. We're making a difference. And they say you have to evolve or dissolve. You have to be distinct or be extinct. And I am telling you, we continue to show up, and we're not going to give up, shut up, or let up. Because what we do is what patients want and need. But it's not that simple because of this question. Posed years ago, if what we do is as good as we know it is, doesn't every patient deserve osteopathic care? I didn't like that question. I'm a DO. I know osteopathic medicine. This is mine. But that question kept niggling at me. If what we do is as good as we know it is, doesn't every patient deserve osteopathic care? Well, you know the answer. The education is already proceeding. I see articles all the time. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know what kind of changes are going to be required, but we will not dissolve. We will not be extinct because patients want what we do. So let me tell you a little story that exemplifies where I think we're going. My 3 sisters and I were in Paris in 2012. We sat down for lunch in a lovely little sidewalk cafe across the river from Notre Dame, and I ordered French onion soup. So our youngest sister, smart Alec, said, "We're in France. It's just onion soup." So someday, and please pay very, very close attention to how I'm saying this, so I don't want to be misquoted. Someday, our patients will not have to seek osteopathic health care because our tenets and our principles are permeating how health care is being delivered. Someday, it'll all be osteopathic health care because they're learning. Now, last month, I spoke at the academic physician section at the AMA, and a faculty from Temple came up to the microphone and said, "How do I learn OMT to take care of my patients in the opioid crisis?" So I would submit that certainly OMT is very, very important, but it's not the whole picture. So remember that ER doc I told you about and the patient with the back pain? So here's the rest of her email. The doctor wrote, "She was remarkably comfortable appearing for someone in the ED, and even more remarkably, she refused pain control. I emphasize her control and comfort because I would not have ordered labs on an otherwise healthy-appearing young person with back pain, except for the exquisite tenderness at a reflex point. The diagnosis? Gallstone pancreatitis." And the DO went on to write, "It demonstrates hope for all DOs who do MD residency programs. We will always be DOs," she wrote. The author, Henry Stanley Haskins, is famous for saying the things that lie behind us and the things that lie before us are tiny matters compared to the things that lie within us. We will always be DOs, and we're still blazing a trail. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Dr. Nichols. That was fabulous. Thank you for those thoughts. I now invite Dr.